Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here in the John Hope Franklin Center in our studios, and we're joined today by Professor André M. Carrington, who is Assistant Professor of English at Drexel University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He's the author of Speculative Blackness, The Future of Race in Science Fiction. That's the University of Minnesota Press. How are you doing today, Professor Carrington?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us here. I think there were many people that were excited about your book. And I imagine that, you know, as I heard you deliver various iterations of it before it was published, oh, this is going to be the black science fiction book. But you're very clear in the beginning, right, that this is not a book about black science fiction, right? It really is about the role of blackness, right, in this broader world, right, of speculative fiction, science fiction, et cetera. Talk a little bit about that distinction.
Yeah, it's, as I try to describe it anytime I get the opportunity, it's about blackness and science fiction, but also blackness in science fiction. So there can't be any one black science fiction book, right? If it were, it would be the book that a black science fiction author creates and they decide to determine what that means. But for me, writing it and pulling together these different variations on what blackness means to science fiction and what that genre means to us as black people was a way to really remind people that we create those terms. We create those concepts of our identity, real and imagined, and we see ourselves or project ourselves into the imaginations of the public in forms like science fiction. So in that way, right, it belongs to us, right? Blackness is a part of science fiction, but science fiction is a part of blackness. Fantasy, horror, thrillers, they're all part of the culture that we participate in creating.
You make some very conscious choices in terms of the subject matter of the book, right? So there'll be some fans that might look through the table of contents and say, okay, why is there not a chapter on Samuel Delany, right? Why is there not a chapter on Octavia Butler? Right. Talk about those choices, right? To go beyond what you might think of as the canon of black science fiction.
That's a great question. It's one that I anticipate, and I tried to talk about in the introduction by saying it is so excellent that Delany and Butler have done such good work and that others have written about them. And I feel like I know that they know their names, I know that people know their work, and I know that people know what has been said about them before. I can't honestly say that what I have to say about this topic that we already know is so much more illuminating than what someone else has done or what someone else is doing now. And I feel like Delany especially is an author and a critic whose work speaks for itself, and he speaks for it. So I draw on the ideas that they've put out there, the concepts that they've given us as models for the significance of what they do, and say, let's see this further afield. Let's see who else does this work where we might not necessarily look for it.
Scholars who do work in popular music studies have always had to walk this fine line between being a fan of a genre of music, a fan of a band or an artist, and then trying to find a way to apply a critical lens, you know, to their scholarship. And sometimes that's, you know, something that's not going to endear you to an artist. It clearly won't endear you to record labels in some contexts and things like that. And the same thing goes for science fiction. And you talk about, you know, going from the one hand, just simply being a fan of the genre. But you also you were positioned at some point as a beta, right? Someone who is essentially testing, you know, works in progress. What was it like to do that kind of work, you know, having also this kind of critical and scholarly lens? And as you're working through the book, you know, trying to turn off the fan person, right, for the critical person, or did you, right? Did you actually find it was helpful that you were coming to this, you know, critically as someone who was a fan?
I never turned off the fandom. I can't turn it off. You know, there are moments when I wish I could, right? Because sometimes when you care about something you see in culture, you know that you can't be objective if anybody could, right? I know that maybe somebody can, but I'm not the one when it comes to Star Trek, and I'm not the one when it comes to Storm, right? So my love for the material I read is really what sustains my interest. And one of the things that I think we can learn from other fan scholars whom I cite in the book and other fans with whom I'm in conversation is that fandom is, in a way, it's a scholarly attention to material that other people consume and let go. and it's a scholarly attention to things that people look at and think critically about, but maybe that criticism is more skeptical, is more negative, and they reject it. For me, fandom sometimes means you stick with it and see where it takes you, and that's a really constructive way to be a scholar, in my view.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here at the John Hope Franklin Center. We're joined by Professor André M. Carrington, talking about his new book, Speculative Blackness, University of Minnesota Press. One of the things that excited me about the book, and I can remember seeing a very early iteration of it, and it must have been American Studies, some time ago. And it's like, okay, this dude's doing some interesting shit. I'm looking forward to this. But one of your chapters is on one of my favorite characters in all of what we might think of as the Black cultural production universe, Benjamin Sisko. Always been a big fan of Avery Brooks in terms of the actor, but then what he brings to the table in terms of Deep Space Nine. Talk about your relationship to Benjamin Sisko, particularly in this broader Star Trek world.
So what's so distinctive to me about Star Trek Deep Space Nine is, for one, I saw it on television at a moment when I was just old enough to kind of appreciate, serious storytelling and appreciate sort of appointment viewing, the way that television was when a show came on once a week and you had to be there. That's sort of just come back around now.
I like that, appointment viewing.
Yeah, so it was a moment that really initiated me into that. And what Ben Sisko as a character stands for is something really unique. It's a version of this myth of, an explorer in the future, seeing the universe, representing humankind, but humankind in a Black body, and being a kind of conventional Black male protagonist in a show, right? He's a single father and has a son, and there was that level of empathy that I could have. And I saw that in Stephen Barnes's novel about an episode of that show, he saw that too for himself. And it wasn't so much that this was the end, right? That we had finally arrived and we were done, but it was a moment that said, okay, this is a series, it's a saga that's been going on for a generation at this point, and it's our turn, right? We're in it, we're here. And that meant that while other places you could see Black people implicitly, and you could see Black women like Nichelle Nichols really define that this future is going to include us, this future is going to be ours. And to see Ben Sisko as this, intellectually curious, strong-willed, but very empathetic kind of character was just beautiful. And the choice for Avery Brooks to perform that role and the energy he brought to it over years.
And that over-the-top almost way that he does everything.
Yeah.
Right?
See, but he isn't a ham like William Shatner.
Right.
He's just really earnest. He both couldn't be any more of a sort of classical stage actor, and he couldn't be any more Black doing that job.
When you think about the landscape now, and everybody's talking about things like, the Black Panther, both the series and also the movie, when you think about Luke Cage, when you were sitting down doing this work a few years ago, could you imagine this landscape as it's developed now? I mean, the landscape has always been there, right?
Yeah.
But now it has bubbled up to the mainstream in ways that, it's surprising, I think, in some ways.
I could have imagined it. I didn't, but I could have. And I saw at the time, one of the things that I wanted to get away from was talking about science fiction as a genre that people write in, that isn't so respected, that people write in to make money, to turn out product, and to really get their work done and live as an author. I didn't want to be preoccupied with whether or not science fiction is respected or respectable. I wanted to deal with the fact that it's popular. It's what people tune into. It's multi-billion-dollar film franchises. And knowing that, to me, means taking a different approach to it as a critic, saying, no, this is not obscure and something that people need to learn about. It's something so visible, so prominent, that we might not think critically about it. We might see it and take it for granted.
Yeah. There are ways in which, when we talk about, particularly from a scholar's standpoint, Black speculative fiction, there's lots of terms that gets bandied about. Some of them are interchangeable. You lay them out very distinctly, right? This idea of Afro-futurism, the idea of surrealism, what you call otherworldness,
Otherhood, yeah.
Otherhood, right? Otherhood. And then this last piece of hauntings. Talk about those 4 very different ways to think about Black science fiction.
Yeah, so I recognize that, in this sense that speculative fiction is something that belongs to us as Black people, that
Right.
it is something that emerges out of our intellect and our experience.
It's within Blackness, the
Yes.
description of science fiction. It's not unlike womanism and feminism.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly, right? I borrow the term otherhood from Isaiah Lavender, who wrote a great, fantastic book called, I think it's just Race in American Science Fiction. It has sort of a subtitle, Blackness in a White Genre, but it's not just that on the inside. And this idea of otherhood is, being the other, but also really inhabiting that space, right? It's your space, it's our hood, right? And that's who we are. So in a way, occupying that position as marginal or minority really defines what that space is about in fiction. And I thought that's beautiful, and it's really a version of the many ways that we claim spaces like that and fantasies like that. Surrealism is a point of view and a movement and a way of life that Robin Kelley has written a fair amount about, and it speaks to a particular generation, a particular moment, but that undercurrent of sort of using non-realist and anti-realist strategies is really salient for Black folks, I think, especially because what's realistic and what's rational hasn't always worked out so well for us.
And it's a term that seems to have a certain kind of gravitas, right, in comparison to science fiction,
Yes.
right? Or
Yeah, surrealism is, it's an artistic movement,
Right.
it's a revolutionary movement, it's prestigious, but it's also sort of in the spirit.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that makes it compelling for Black artists. These other notions of haunting and Afrofuturism, I think we see them in different ways throughout African American culture, especially. Afrofuturism is a really broad term that can kind of include the others.
Right.
But to me, very simply, it means that there is a future that is Black, right? That Blackness has a future, and there's a future that in which we see ourselves, right? We put ourselves in it, we make it our own.
I often joke with my students, and some of them are a little too young now, but I think about a series like The Jetsons.
Yeah.
And the generation of folks who watched The Jetsons when it decided to be PC. But for folks who watched the first generation of it, there were no Black people in the future. It was like, whoa. It's like, as a kid, you're not paying attention to that. At some point, you're watching it when you're 20 years old. It's like, okay, if Rosie's a robot,
yeah, that's it.
It's like, where the Black?
Yeah, if they needed us then, they don't anymore. And that's just like, whoa, we just we're not even there.
Yeah.
That's wild, right? I think Afrofuturism is a way of saying, let's reject that, right? We see the future that other people have in mind for us, and we would like to make our own. Haunting is, in a way, sort of the result of those ways of not seeing us in the future and not seeing our ongoing presence in the present. Avery Gordon's book about haunting and the sociological imagination brings that term to mind, but anytime we see sort of the presence of unanswered questions, unasked, unmet needs in the experience of Black people in the world, in the present today, that quality of what we can't quite define or can't quite address, that's haunting. And it's that for us, but it's also, in a way, what Blackness means to America's sense of itself and what humanity understands as sort of its obligation to all of its parts, right? That there's been a part of humanity that hasn't sort of had its chance to live in the ways that it ought to, but that's different from saying, oh, it's dead, it's in the past, let's not think about it. Haunting is the fact that that's not true.
Okay. We love playlists on Left of Black in all their various iterations. Let's suppose for a moment the New York Times calls you up and they're doing a piece on speculative blackness. And they ask you to give them 5 texts broadly defined, that would serve as an introduction to speculative blackness.
I would tell them to watch Janelle Monáe's video for Many Moons. I showed it in my science fiction class last night.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful, it's conceptual, it's part of a narrative, and it does,
Yeah.
right, what I try to capture, what I try to analyze. She is an artist who does it,
Yeah,
particularly
yeah,
in that
yeah.
performance. I would include that. I would include Dahlgren by Samuel Delany, because it's a text that you just have to get into and get lost and find your way through. It's a text that gives you a very thorough sense of sort of living in a city, in a post-industrial city, but in a way that is so like real life and so estranged from it that you really feel something reading your way through it. I would suggest Wild Seed by Octavia Butler, because it's a novel that is part of a series but makes that diasporic journey. And it starts with an idea of Black ancestry and an idea of just how deeply rooted Black womanhood and the different forms that Black life can take in it, that I feel like makes it a more powerful story than just like one moment or the future or the present. Along with them, I would include Ray Bradbury's story, at least one of them from the Martian Chronicles. There's one called Way Up in the Middle of the Air, and it's about Bradbury's writing during the 50s, and I point out in the book, and I feel like some other people notice this, but maybe don't say it. The golden age of science fiction is also, the height of Jim Crow, right? It's a critical point for a struggle against segregation at a time that people think of as a golden age.
Right.
But Bradbury saw it exactly that way. And in that story, Black folks are fed up, so they go to Mars.
Yeah.
And they're doing all right. And they say, oh, hey, I guess we were right. White supremacy really was the problem. And when white folks show up, because they're also coming to Mars, they have to decide if they're going to offer them hospitality, if they want to live with them on a whole other planet. That story says so much.
Right.
And
in the 1950s.
It said what was necessary at the time. And beyond that, I guess to put a punctuation mark on it, I would suggest the writing of Suzanne Césaire from the 1940s. Césaire was, she was married to Aimé Césaire, who's associated with negritude and surrealism. And her variation on that was, in a lot of ways, more stridently political. It was more about getting her writing into the world against censorship, against Nazi regime's occupation, and really making the case for the intellect and the creativity of people of Martinique, of Black women, of Antillean peoples, in a way that really encompassed an idea of humanity and an idea of life that isn't human, that's so out of this world, that's just so surreal and vegetable and alive and post-human, that really needed to break out of that moment of censorship and break out of its original language to reach us. I would say that's an essential thing to read.
What's next for you?
I'm working now on writing about the one form I don't write about in Speculative Blackness, which is radio plays. The War of the Worlds, right, is this cultural touchstone. It's quintessentially American. It tells us what radio is all about, and it really stands for sort of American popular culture in a certain moment. And I thought, if I can write about a lot of different varieties of culture that all display to us how Blackness and speculative fiction have these strange careers together, I want to spend some time on this one tradition of radio plays and see how in that era, in later generations, making works by white authors and Black authors and with different performers from different backgrounds, how they do that work of bringing a text from one medium to another and one audience to another, and make us hear it, make us feel it in a different way than we would if we read it on paper.
You're watching Left of Black. We've been joined today by Professor André M. Carrington, who's Assistant Professor of English at Drexel University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He's the author of the brand new book, Speculative Blackness, published by the University of Minnesota Press. Thank you for joining us, André.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.